Hello, I'm David from Germany. Welcome to my booktube channel Polyglot Reading, where I talk about books that I read in foreign languages. Today's video is just a short and superficial wrap-up of the books I read in December last year. December was a very fruitful reading month, lots of holidays, and it's winter here in Germany, so little gardening to do outside. So I had a lot of time that I could spend with my books. Let's go through the books one by one, language after language. I think I don't need to introduce Trollope to the English-speaking booktube viewers, but I think he is actually very little known outside the English-speaking countries, which is a pity because I think he was one of the best Victorian authors, also a very prolific one, wrote 47 novels. So far I've only read 12 of them, so I'm happy that there's still a lot to explore for me. In December, I read these two novels from the Palliser series. I think it's the second and the third volume of the series, but they can all be read as standalone volumes as well. Phineas Finn and Phineas Redux. And these two novels, we follow the main character, Phineas Finn, on his way from his provincial home in Ireland into the London society, into the political world of the British Empire. He is the son of a country physician. It's not a poor family, but as a country physician, the family doesn't make much money. There are many children, so there are some difficulties and some constraints. And Phineas Finn gets a training and education in the field of law, but he doesn't want to work as a lawyer, as a barrister. He has high ambitions. He wants to become part of the political world. He wants to contribute to the political system. He wants to become member of parliament. And so he goes to London, and where he struggles a bit to make his way into the London society and into the political world. So at that time, being member of the parliament was not a paid job. I don't know whether it is today. And so it was a bit difficult. He got a small allowance from his father. So the novel describes how this young man from the Irish countryside makes his way into the London society and into the political system. And it has two levels. It's about his personal relations and about the political system and in his work and his relations and the tensions and conflicts in these both parts of his life. So there is a lot of political things going on, but there's also there is a love story, several love stories in there. He has his childhood love back home, Mary, and he wants to be faithful to her, but once he enters into the London society, there are all these wealthy and elegant, intelligent and beautiful women, and he has sort of a proclivity to fall quickly in love with them, but none of the relation really works out. And also in the political scene, there's a lot of conflict. When I read the story, the main topic that is behind these stories is that Trollope shows us that there are conflicts of loyalty between the protagonist's inner morals and virtues and convictions and the loyalties to different other people. And I think that there we see some sort of love triangle, but loyalty triangle, I would like to call it. Sometimes it's even a loyalty pentagon. So it's this conflict of making, it's this conflict of trying to match the inner convictions, the inner morals, with the necessities of the relation to others, with the loyalty to others, to one or two or three other people. And this tension of loyalty at the personal scene and at the political scene, this is what drives the plot. There's some adventure in there. He at one point becomes falsely accused of murder. He is trialed. He's running the risk of being hanged for it. So it's a quite captivating story, a captivating plot, and sometimes these Palliser novels are called political novels, but the reader shouldn't get scared off by that. You don't need to know all the intricacies and subtleties of the UK parliamentary system not of today, let alone of the 19th century. You will pick up the essentials when reading the story. I like these two Trollope novels very much, as I did all Trollope novels so far. To be honest, I really love Trollope even more than Dickens. Nothing bad about Dickens. Please don't get me wrong. I love Dickens. I think he is the master of creating plots. But what I like better with Trollope is the development of character. With Dickens, I often get the impression that some characters are quite simply described. They are almost like caricatures. They are some characters are completely good or completely bad or completely weird or completely funny. And with Trollope, it's much more different. I think that the characters that he describes and develops are much more complex. There is more subtlety through the description and also to the development and change of the character. We can in these novels clearly see the growth or the decline of characters. And none of them are really totally good or totally bad. Even there are some villains in Trollope's novel. That's clear. But even those, at some point, they are described in a way where you can relate to their way of thinking and understand what drives them or what made them the characters they are, and what were the events that tainted their ambitions. I think this is a real strength of Trollope, developing characters, and that's why I love his novels so much. Another English book that I didn't read as a physical copy, but that I listened to as an audiobook, is a more contemporary work. It's not yet a classic, but I think it has potential to become a classic. It's the novel that is called Station 11 by the Canadian author Emily St. John Mandel. It is a novel that was written in, I think, 2017, way before the COVID pandemics, but it actually uses a similar setting. It describes how a very contagious disease, which is called the Georgia flu, quickly spreads over the world within a few days, and due to international air travel. And it's far more dangerous than COVID. It actually kills 99.9% of the world population within a few weeks. And the book describes how within a few days, everything falls down. All the infrastructures and parts of technology that we have really rely on and that we take for granted, they fail and disintegrate. So within a few days, there's no electricity, there's no mobile phone communication, there's no internet, there's no travel, there are no hospitals, there's no medicine, there's no water supply. And the few remaining and surviving people, which are scattered in small groups and small clusters across the world, just trying to survive and try to make a living. And try to rearrange themselves and reorganize small spots and clusters of human society. And that's one level of the story, one part of the narrative. And the other part describes a situation about 20 years later when a small group of people, mainly artists, travel as a group across the country, across the former Canadian and former US part of the North American continent. And they are they're actually a theater group. They call themselves the Traveling Symphony, because they visit all these small scattered communities and perform Shakespeare plays and perform music. To preserve some sort of the former culture and to provide some sort of entertainment to the people, and they make a living by that. And so they come across very different communities and that have formed. So each of the communities is organized in a different way. Some of them are very well run and organized in an almost democratic way. Others are organized in an autocratic way. There's a tyrant there. There are religious movements, doomsday sects that dominate some of these communities. And they're actually in search of a couple of their members that had separated from them 1 or 2 years earlier because they were a couple. They had been expecting a baby, and so that they had decided that they could not continue the travel, but they settled in one of these communities. And the traveling symphony now travels to that community and notices that this community has changed rapidly during the past 3 years. It actually fell into the hand of one of those doomsday prophets and is run in a very tyrannical way, and their former colleagues are not there anymore. And so they set out for searching for them, but in doing so, they really get in conflict with the religious leader of this community, and they're chased by that community. And that's what drives the plot. And I won't tell more in order not to place any plot spoilers in here. It's a captivating story on a superficial level. You really want to know how it turns out and which one of the characters survives on both levels of the story. But it's also a very profound and well thought through story about what actually remains when everything fails that we as a society usually rely on, that we take for granted. And how does this work out? Such a critical situation. What does it do to bring out the best, but also the worst in some people? And what helps society to reorganize in a good way or in a bad way? And what is the role of tradition and culture and the arts and music of the nice things? What role can it play as an antidote to all these atrocities that one encounters in such a situation? Moving on to German. In German, I read the novel Der Untertan, that means the loyal subject in English, by Heinrich Mann, the brother of Thomas Mann. And this was actually a reread. I had read this book, I think 10 years ago, but I wanted to rediscover it. And this is, I think, still a very important book, although it's more than 100 years old. It's sort of a Bildungsroman. So we follow the development of a character called Dietrich Hässling from his infancy through his young years as a student, and then later as an economically successful man in his native provincial town, and up into the field of politics. But it is sort of a perverted or inverted Bildungsroman, because we do not see the growth of the character into a more noble and more educated character, but actually we see his decline into becoming a very mean character, into becoming a character that is very preposterous, pretentious. It describes the development of the character into a person who is representative of that sort of people who enable the rise and who enable the rise of dictatorship, who were responsible for this very dangerous ideology of the supremacy of a specific nation, and of the ambitions to go into war with other nations and to dominate over other nations. And I think this is something that we still see, and the global level today in many countries, that people are prone to this sort of ideology. So the main protagonist, Dietrich Hässling, starts out as a very weak and soft child. He's the son of the owner of a local paper and pulp factory, and he later becomes a student of chemistry and even gets his PhD, so he's not a stupid person. Later he becomes the heir of his father's family. But as I mentioned, he starts as a very weak and timid person with a lot of self-consciousness. But he gains his strength and importance by linking himself to organizations or people that are of higher rank, of higher authority than himself. And he gains his importance from being fully, completely loyal to them and to adoring everything that these organizations or people do, in particular if these are people representing the government. Or his greatest idol is the German Kaiser, so he adores everything that people of authority do, even if it's outrageously ridiculous, like the local public governor farting in public. He is using this sort of borrowed second-rate importance to pump up his own sense of importance and power, and in turn he's trampling down onto others of lower rank or of weaker character than him. So when he becomes the heir of his father's paper factory, he is a really suppressive, tyrannical owner, suppressing the workers and the rights. And the novel describes in a clear way how this person develops and makes its way up into also the political society, becomes very successful just by using a lot of intrigue, by even denunciation of his political enemies, and by being a loyal subject to the dominant political ideology of that time in Germany. So the Kaiser being the idol, and sort of this idea of German supremacy above other nations. So this novel is a satire of a Bildungsroman. It's a tough and heavy subject, but it is written in a very funny way because Heinrich Mann uses the elements of a satire. So this, for example, this devotion of Dietrich to the Kaiser is described in a way which is really almost funny. For example, one day when there's a parade in Berlin, he follows the group of the Kaiser, and unter den Linden, it's slippery, and he falls down, and he's covered in mud. He's sitting at the earth, and he's covered in mud. But the Kaiser is passing by on his horse, and the Kaiser is laughing. And Dietrich Hässling is so glad, he's so glad that the Kaiser laughed at him. He doesn't become aware that the Kaiser is actually mocking at him and laughing and making ridicule of him. He feels so enthusiastic about the Kaiser looking down at him and laughing at him. And even during his honeymoon, he travels to Rome with his young wife, and when in Rome, he learns that accidentally also the German Kaiser is making a visit to Rome, and so he leaves his wife at the hotel. He spends 2 or 3 days just by running across the city, just to be always the first in line of the crowd of the mass that is cheering and hailing the Kaiser. And this is described in a really ridiculous way. He even makes it into a local Italian newspaper, and here again he doesn't become aware of that he's actually ridiculed, but he's feeling great about it, being the most loyal subject to his Kaiser. And I think this novel is still relevant because the context has changed a lot. So we are not living anymore in the world of the Kaiser in Germany, but I think the basic mechanisms that are described here, they still work. How weak characters can be seduced and their loyalty be exploited by a pathological political system. So political leaders can use very simple authoritarian structures and also very hollow phrases about the self-acclaimed greatness of a nation, to the supremacy above others, to mobilize that sort of weak characters and transform society into a dangerous and explosive mixture of underlings ready to support the preposterous claim to supremacy and to suppress or even eliminate minorities or dissidents. And these are not always stupid people, as it's shown in this novel. Dietrich Hässling has got a PhD in chemistry, so he's well trained, but still it's this sort of weak characters exploited by a political system that can really create a lot of menace to our democratic society within a country and at an international level. Moving on to Italian, in December I read two novels by the Italian author Grazia Deledda. Again, an author who I think outside of Italy is almost unknown or forgotten. At least I think in Germany she's almost unknown. I had never heard of her until I think 2 or 3 years ago, when I started more intensely to read Italian literature in its original language. So I read these two books in Italian edition. So this is a nice edition of the Italian publisher Mondadori, a special series called I Meridiani that collects the main works of given authors in one handy volume. It's nice binding. I think it's in synthetic leather, and it's printed on India paper. So it's about 1,000 pages, but it's still a handy volume. I read two novels that are contained in that volume. The first one is considered, I think, her masterpiece, Canne, vento. That means reeds in the wind in English. And I think that is the novel for which Grazia Deledda was also awarded the Nobel Prize of Literature in 1926. And it's located on the island of Sardinia, which is also the home island of Grazia Deledda. And it tells the story of the three Pintor sisters, which are sisters, descendants of a declined local noble family. Nowadays they're small landowners and they're struggling to make a living. They have still this sense of nobleness, of being above the need to do regular work, but so in a more clandestine way, they're selling fruits and vegetables that grow in their gardens. Everybody knows it, but it's not done openly. And they're supported by one of the former servants of the family. He's called Ephis or Ephix. He is very loyal to these three ladies. He supports them in many ways, even although he doesn't get paid. And there's some secret behind that. There seems to be a terrible deed by him, a terrible sin of the past that is now trying to compensate for by his loyalty as a servant to the family. And then he helps them during their struggles to make a living. And then there's also a greedy cousin, a more wealthy landowner who also wants to buy at cheap price the land of these three Pinter sisters. So this is a threat to their economic situation. And then suddenly a nephew pops up, the son of a fourth sister. He seems to be a very ambitious young man, but it turns out he's all words. It is actually a good for nothing type of guy. He has a proclivity to gambling and even is putting the three sisters into even more difficult economic situation. And so this constellation is what drives the plot, the difficult economic situation on the one hand, the sense of being noble, but not in a good economic position, and this tension with this young nephew, this good for nothing, and the greedy cousin and the loyal servant. This drives the story forward. And I don't want to tell more in order not to spoil the plot, how these conflicts are resolved or not. So I think this novel is really a masterpiece. It describes in a very vivid way the adding a lot of local color, the way that these small rural societies in Sardinia were organized in the 19th century. We learn a lot about the local traditional customs and habits, and also superstitions and strange rituals of the people. We see how the relations in this small rural society work, and where everybody knows everybody and has been knowing everybody for decades, and there's a strong history of links or animosities between families. And we also learn a lot about how the nature of that environment, the scorching sun, the dryness, the hard labor to make the hard labor to get fruit growing there, how that dominates and forms the society. The second novel of Grazia Deledda in that volume that I read is La Madre, the Mother, and it also is located in a rural society in Sardinia, and it describes the conflict of a young Catholic priest who starts as a very observant priest, but in this rural community, he suddenly falls in love with a local woman, she's the only descendant of a formerly wealthy family, so she is sort of alone in that society because she's the only woman of rank. And he, as a Catholic priest, he is living with his mother, but he also feels sort of lonely, and the two fall in love, and this creates a huge conflict for him between this love and his conscience. But actually what we see is not only his own inner conflict, it's also the conflict of the mother, who has cared a lot about her son, and she's also a very pious woman, a very observant woman. And actually, it turns out that she has an even stronger conflict of conscience about this than he. It looks like that she experiences on his behalf this strong inner conflict between piety and following the religious rules and this love affair. So, and again, we have this sort of triangle of love and of conflict. We learn a lot about the psychology, at least of the two main characters, about the young priest and about his mother. And at the end, this story takes a very surprising twist and turn. I won't tell more. But again, I think another great work of Grazia Deledda, also with a lot of local color, also a very important role of nature, of the natural forces, of the natural elements in the story, and a great psychological study of this mother-son relationship and of an inner conflict between the piety, religious rules on the one hand, and emotions, love on the other hand. Grazia Deledda is, by the way, also a very interesting personality, or has been an interesting personality. She herself was raised in Sardinia, and she got very little formal education. I think that was more or less common at that time in the late 19th century in Italy. But when she became successful as a writer, actually something very interesting happened. She was married to a man who had a high position in the Italian Ministry of Defense and highly successful. And he actually quit his job in order to be able to support full-time his wife's literary ambitions and to act as her literary agent. And so we are talking about the early 1900s here. So this was very progressive at that time, in particular in Italy, where it took another almost 50 years until women got the right to actively participate in political elections, for example. So it was a very progressive couple. Grazia Deledda and her husband, a very interesting personality, and I'm very curious to read the other novels also that are. I am very curious to read the other novels that are also contained in this nice little volume. I read two French books in December. The first one is I read in parallel in this German translation and the French original on my Kindle. It's the novel Le roman d'un enfant, or The Story of a Child, or Roman eines Kindes in German. It's a very short novel, but still a great piece of literature of the impressionistic area, childhood memories, and what role do memories play in the formation of our personality and our character. I don't want to go into detail here because I made a video dedicated only on an in-depth review of this little novel. Please check out that video if you're interested in it. The second book that I read in French is a sort of an exception, because it's not a book originally written in French. It's a translation from English. It's in English, I think it's The Great Panda and the Little Dragon. It looks like a children's book, but it is actually not. So on each double page, there's a small dialogue between the great panda and the little dragon, and there's usually also a nice illustration. And the dialogues are pieces of wisdom influenced usually by the Buddhist tradition. Very easy language, easy to read, but still deep thoughts in there, or nice thoughts. Just to give you an example, from memory, the great panda asked the little dragon, in a journey, what's the most important thing, the destination or the pathway? It's the companion, answers the little dragon. So that's very, very nice, very concise, but yeah, very, very wise things in there in these little dialogues. So I think this book is also perfect as a present for a person who learns a foreign language. I think there are translations in many languages available, and as I mentioned, it's easy to read, easy to understand. The vocabulary is not that difficult, not that complex, or even if it is, from the illustrations you get the meaning, and so it's really a very nice reading experience. Nothing to read in one step from front to cover, but it's really something to pick up and read 1 or 2 pages and enjoying it. Okay, let's move on to Yiddish as the final language. In Yiddish, I just read 1 book this month. Again, this is not a book that was originally published in Yiddish, but it's a translation from English. It's the first volume of Heri Poter, which exists also in Yiddish translation. And I read this particularly for language learning purpose. So I'm not a fan of Heri Poter at all. Nothing bad about it. I read it when my children were young, so I read it together with them, and I watched other movies, but actually I consider this more of a children's or young adults literature, so not my cup of tea as an adult. But the good thing is that you know the plot and you know the story and the character, and this helps a lot when you start reading in a foreign language. So I was happy that recently this first volume of Heri Poter had been translated into Yiddish. So Heri Poter und der philosophischer shteyn. As you may notice from the cover, it's written in Hebrew letters, and you have to read it from right to left. So it's a bit of a challenge. You need to get used to that. Yeah, reading a book where you know the plot really helps a lot. This is something that I can highly recommend if you have the ambition to learn a language, or if you are a little bit advanced and want to start reading literature in a foreign language. Start with a children's book, or start with a book for young adults where the language is not so complicated and where you already know the plot because you have read it in your native language. That helps a lot with the reading process in a foreign language. Okay, that's it for December. I hope you have enjoyed this short overview. Please let me know in the comments whether you have read any of these books as well, and whether you liked or disliked it, or whether you would like to have a more detailed review of any of these books that I read in December. Thank you very much for listening and watching, and see you next time. Take care, bye-bye, and ciao.